So we'll get started here. Thank you again for everyone who's joining today. My name is Brian Walsh. I lead the financial planning team here at SoFi, and I'm really excited for this opportunity to have a webinar, not only to have an amazing guest, talk about a very important topic, but then also, honestly, this is a topic that comes across on a regular basis as our financial planners are talking with members. And, that's really, I think, the really cool thing about my job at SoFi is getting to see what our planners are talking about with our members on a day in and day out basis. And then as enough of those conversations happen, we go and we find industry experts in those particular areas and really decide to bring it in and say, okay, now let's have this conversation and really dive into this topic. So today we are joined by Dr. Sharon from Modern Fertility, and we're really going to be focused on planning your family's future and what that means from both a health as well as a financial perspective. Obviously, I'll talk about more of the financial side of things and then really kind of pass it on over. So Sharon, would you like to introduce yourself and kick things off before we get started?
I'd love to. Thank you so much, Brian. And hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be joining SoFi today and talk about one of my favorite topics, which is fertility. As Brian mentioned, my name is Sharon, and I'm the head of clinical product development at Modern Fertility. I have a PhD in genetics from Stanford, where I studied early embryo development and stem cell biology. Currently, I oversee all of the scientific and clinical science that supports Modern Fertility's products and services. And before we dive in, Brian, if you don't mind moving to the next slide, we've got to cover the disclaimers. So the lawyers, I'm sure, will certainly recommend that you read all of this information in detail, but the quick summary here is that this talk is meant to be educational. It is not intended to be personal financial advice, and it's not intended to be personal medical advice. However, the goal is that what we talk about today and the frameworks we discuss will be able to be applied to your personal situation. All right, let's get into the good stuff. So today we're going to be talking about fertility and reproductive planning. But before we get into the planning part, I really want to ground us all in the same terminology and background info. You can consider this sort of a refresher on sex ed. You'll notice on the left side here, we have the female reproductive tract and the male reproductive tract on the right. And I want to just do a quick note on terminology here. I'm going to use the term female, and when I use that, I'm referring to individuals who were assigned female at birth. Similarly, when I use the term male, also referring to individuals who are assigned male at birth. So let's start over here with the female reproductive tract, and I want to draw your attention first to the ovary. Now it's labeled, but you can also identify it because it looks a little bit like Swiss cheese. And that is because each ovary contains eggs, where each one of those little dots is intended to represent a single egg. The total number of eggs that we have is highest at birth and slowly decreases over the course of our lifetime until the menopause. And starting at puberty, a single egg will be released on average once a month at the midpoint of the menstrual cycle. Now, the egg is released from the ovary into the fallopian tube. And after it's released, it only has about a 12 to 24-hour window where it is receptive to being fertilized. And sperm may already be present in the fallopian tube when the egg is released. And that would be the result of either prior intercourse or insemination that may have happened in the days leading up to ovulation. If sperm isn't already present, sperm needs to make its way to the egg in the fallopian tube within that 12 to 24-hour period. If it's after that period, fertilization can't actually take place. Now, regardless if the egg is fertilized or not, it will travel through the rest of the fallopian tube down into the uterus. And if fertilization has taken place, that egg, which we now call an embryo after fertilization, will implant in the lining of the uterus. If you want to use the scientific term, it's endometrium as labeled on the slide, but that is the supporting tissue that will help support the embryo to grow and develop into a pregnancy. On the other hand, if the egg isn't fertilized, the body actually sheds the endometrium along with the egg, and that is what is our monthly period. So now let's switch things over to the male reproductive side. And our rapid tour through the biology of the male reproductive system starts in the testicles, or the testes. And that is where sperm production begins. It takes on average about 90 days to complete sperm maturation. And what's really interesting is that unlike the ovary, which has a fixed number of eggs assigned at birth, the testes produce sperm continuously throughout the male lifetime. After the maturation process happens in the testes, the sperm will move into the epididymis, which you can think of as kind of a storage facility until ejaculation. At that point, sperm will travel through the vas deferens. It will meet up with fluid from the seminal vesicle and fluid from the prostate, and finally is ejaculated through the urethra. What is one of my favorite facts about sperm production and male reproductive biology here is that the testes actually produce about 100,000 viable sperm per day. And that's really interesting when you juxtapose that to what the ovary does in a month, which is produce one single egg. So if we go to the next slide, I think it's really important, even though we talk about male and female biology separately, when it comes to getting pregnant, it really does come down to one egg and one sperm. And what that means is that both male and female aspects and biology are important. And we know this because we can learn from couples who are struggling for infertility when we try to understand what is the reason for their infertility. And what we know is that approximately a third of the time it's a female-only issue, a third of the time it's a male-only issue, and a third of the time it's combined. And so what that really shows is that it really is a 50-50 partnership on both the male side and the female side. But as we all know, it's not just the biology that needs to be working. I think for a lot of us, there's a ton of other considerations that go in. Probably most importantly is the financial aspects.
Perfect, thank you. And I think related to the financial aspect, this is something that, we want to talk through at a high level, because I think there are common aspects of personal finances as people go through this journey and go through different life stages that apply to a lot of people, and those common themes, and that's what we want to talk about. And at the same time, everyone's situation is going to be relatively unique. You could look at two individuals and something's going to be slightly different, whether it be related to their goals, their priorities, anything along those lines. So at a high level, as we're looking through, going through this journey together from really a family planning perspective, we go through a high level of 3 different steps. The first step, and I think is always important anytime you're looking at any sort of personal finance topic, is to assess your finances. And I think part of that is just establishing that baseline and understanding what's going on with my money. And ultimately, where do I stand? So the 3 common areas that we see people do is, go through as they start through this process is really looking at their overall savings, looking at their bad debt, and looking at their good debt. There can be other aspects of it. It might be related to budgeting and other things like that. But these are really the 3 core areas that we see people focus on, and we recommend that they focus on. So when it comes to savings, typically what we look at is getting an understanding of, what type of cash cushion an individual has. At a high level, we try to target 3 to 6 months worth of expenses. And I think as people transition different life stages, this type of cash cushion ends up becoming more important, because then unexpected events start having a bigger impact. And then as we'll talk about a little bit later, there can be unexpected kind of, hiccups or detours along this journey that may, ultimately rely on, having that cash cushion. Another aspect that we really end up talking through and working through is related to debt. I think, at a high level, we see a lot of people categorize debt as one big, lump. And debt, it is a 4-letter word, but a lot of times people look at debt as always being one of those bad 4-letter words. But the simple fact is there's good debt and there's bad debt. And bad debt, we really want to, assess and see, okay, how much high interest debt do we have? How is that impacting our finances? Versus how much of our debt's good debt, that's low interest rate debt. So let's say under 7%, where it's something we want to manage. So once people go through that first step on, how do we assess our finances, I think the next step is really where everyone takes a little bit different of a viewpoint as they're going through this journey, and that's uncovering the goals and the priorities. There's tons of different things that people can talk through, and they're going to be important to them. But these are three themes that we see emerging over and over again in some way or another, especially as it comes to, related to family planning. So the first one would be related to careers. Everyone views things differently as far as how they want to approach their career, where they see it progressing, what do they want to do, how will this next life stage impact your career plans? Because ultimately those career plans are going to impact your finances. If you make more money, finances become a little bit easier because you could have a little bit more of a cushion. Make less money, finances can become a little bit more challenging. The next area would be, okay, do we want to start investing to build up some sort of cushion to transition? And then finally looking at location. I think this, may not come to the top of people's minds, but, going through this process with, tons of different individuals in the past, even if they're staying in the same, let's say narrow geographic area, looking at the location of, hey, where I live right now may not be where I want to live 1, 2, 3 years down the road. One, ultimately, kids are on the way and things along those lines. So really having that understanding on how that location change may impact your budget and your overall finances. And then finally, if you assess your finances, you go through, you have that conversation and say, okay, here's what the goals and priorities are. Then you develop a specific plan and say, okay, here's what I'm going to focus on for the next 30, 60, 90 days, and then kind of rinse and repeat. Generally speaking, we're not going to plan everything out for the next, 1, 3, or even 5 years all at once. It's more an iterative approach. And what I think is really helpful is looking at it from just like an example timeline perspective. And again, this is more, I guess, illustrative because everyone's timeline is going to be a little bit different. I can speak from firsthand experience. My timeline was probably somewhat similar to this, so I thought it was a good example because I can share my own details rather than sharing members' details. But typically what we see is people are going through this journey, starting with the finances on the top and more on the biological side on the bottom of the line, starting off with a plan, having that high-level conversation related to where do I stand? What are my goals? What are my priorities? And then assuming that, there was priorities related to tackling bad debt, addressing location, building up savings, and then getting a handle over the insurance side of things and the medical costs. This is what that kind of hypothetical timeline would look like. Typically, we would see people focus on one thing at a time. And as they assess, let's say they have bad debt, focusing on how do we pay off our bad debt first, then transitioning to looking at the location. Maybe it's buying a new house. Maybe it's renovating the existing house. Maybe it's moving across the country. I have seen people, transition to moving completely across the country because they're living away from family and they realize that they want to be closer to family during this next stage of their lives. And then finally, as they get closer to, conceiving, really going in and looking at, hey, what do the medical costs look like? Let's start planning this out a little bit more from a granular level. And then most importantly, what do my benefits look like? Because that's going to be a key aspect towards those costs. So I'll transition it on over to talk to the biological half of this hypothetical timeline.
Thanks, Brian. So as you're thinking about the financial timeline, there's a lot of things that we can do in terms of our own health and our fertility. So even before you're ready to start trying, there are lifestyle changes you can start to optimize to give yourself the best shot at a healthy pregnancy. And while there's no limit to how early you can start making these changes, we generally talk about trying to think about them about a year before trying to conceive. It gives you a chance to get used to new habits and make changes, and then give your body enough time to adapt. The number one thing I want to call out with regards to lifestyle is smoking. It's actually the number one factor that is associated with reduced fertility, and stopping or reducing smoking can make a really big difference in the health of your ovaries and your eggs, as well as sperm on the male side. A healthy body really supports a healthy pregnancy, and so that also includes diet and exercise. Now, I wish I could tell you that there was some perfect fertility diet or a perfect fertility food, but in reality, no one such diet or food works. In reality, a diet that is rich in lots of vegetables and whole grains is generally recommended. But again, it depends a little bit on your personal situation. As you move a little bit closer to thinking about starting to try to conceive, it's worth thinking about your birth control. So some methods allow you to stop whenever you want. If you're on a pack of birth control pills, if you use a patch, if you use a vaginal ring, but others require a doctor. So if you have an IUD or an implant, you need a doctor to actually remove those. And so even though there's no scientific evidence that birth control affects your fertility in the long term once you stop, it can take 2 to 3 months for your cycle to completely return to normal. The one exception to that rule is actually among people who use the hormonal shot as contraception. On average, it can take up to 9 months for periods and your menstrual cycle to return to normal. And so it's really worth having a conversation and thinking through the timeline and the flexibility you want with your birth control in relation to when you want to start trying. The other thing I'll mention with stopping birth control is it's a great time to start tracking your cycle. So there are apps and tools, and Modern Fertility actually has its own cycle tracking app to help you understand your cycle better so that you can time when you're trying to the most likely days of success. And we'll get into that in some future slides. The last thing to think about, just as you're going through and thinking about your medical and insurance coverage right before starting, it's really recommended to go talk to a doctor for a preconception visit. Now, a lot of people haven't even heard of a preconception visit, but it's a time for you and your doctor to talk about your reproductive plans and for them to answer any questions you have about your previous health history, any medical conditions or medications you're currently taking, and what to be aware of while you're trying to conceive. Perhaps most importantly, your doctor will recommend that you start taking prenatal vitamins. And in fact, a lot of people don't know that the recommendation is to start prenatal vitamins before you even start trying. Up to 3 months in advance is typically recommended. Now, we've talked a little bit about the basics, how to set an overall timeline, both from a financial perspective and some of the lifestyle and other things you can do from a fertility perspective. But there's a lot of information we've left out. And that is the fact and the unfortunate reality that fertility and our ability to get pregnant is not static throughout our lives. So on top of feeling ready financially and professionally and mentally to start a family, it's really important to understand some of the data related to fertility changes. The first thing that changes with age is, or rather natural fertility changes with age, and it changes both for people with ovaries and for people with testes. I'm going to start on the left, and what you'll see is an illustration of a hypothetical ovary before the age of 35 and another one juxtaposed from someone who is between, let's say, 41 and 45. There are 2 key components to female fertility change with age. The first is that the number of eggs declines over time. As I mentioned, it is the highest at birth and decreases to 0 at menopause. And so that change is happening throughout our reproductive years. The second component is egg quality. One way to think of egg quality is genetic health. And when an egg is genetically healthy, it's more likely to lead to a healthy pregnancy. And when an egg is genetically unhealthy, it's less likely to lead to a healthy pregnancy and maybe more likely to lead to a miscarriage. And so egg quality decreases over time as well. Before switching over to the male side though, I do want to stop and quickly address the myth of the fertility cliff at 35. Now, there's really nothing special about the day you turn 25 that's different than the day you were 34. However, in the 30s is typically when the rate of decline changes. So throughout the 20s, late 20s, and even early 30s, the rate of decline is pretty slow and steady. But at some point in the 30s, and frankly, this differs from individual to individual, the rate that eggs start to decline increases. And so for some people, it might happen earlier than 35. For others, it might happen later. But there is nothing specific or magical about the day you turn 35. All right, we're moving over to the testes side of the equation to talk about sperm. And frankly, it's a little unfair that the biology of the ovaries and the testes aren't more aligned when it comes to age. So for some people, this may be a surprise, but fertility does change for males as well. But it changes about 10 years later on average than it does for females. You'll see that the time to pregnancy, shown in this graph, increases when the male partner is in their mid to late 40s or 50s. Now, the next thing that's really important when it comes to understanding how things change is the chance of conception per cycle. So I don't know if you had this experience, but I feel like when I was in middle school and high school, we talked about sex ed, and classically the gym teacher says, you have sex once, you're going to get pregnant. And that's just frankly not how it works. There are only a few days within the menstrual cycle where fertilization and a pregnancy are even possible. And that's what I was mentioning before about the egg being released from the ovary and being available for fertilization. It has that 12 to 24-hour window. And that's the day indicated by ovulation here. And if it's kind of crazy, honestly, it always surprises me, is that if you have sex or you inseminate on that day, the chance of pregnancy is only about 20%. Estimates vary based on the scientific literature you look at, but it's less than 50% and closer to about 20 to maybe 30% on the day of ovulation. But what may come to a surprise to you looking at this graph is that the days leading up to ovulation have an even higher percentage chance. And that's because sperm can actually survive in the reproductive tract for as long as 5 days. But you'll see that the sweet spot is sort of on the 1 to 3 days before ovulation. The next thing I want to talk about is the chance of getting pregnant over time. I know for a lot of people who are really thinking and taking a very active role in planning for their future family, there can sometimes be this desire or wish to control exactly when we'll get pregnant and when that means we'll have a baby. But the reality is it's just not that under our control. And so what I'm showing here is the cumulative percentage of couples that are getting pregnant after 1 year of actively trying. You'll notice that in the first 3 months of actively trying, a little bit more than half of couples will get pregnant. But it's also important to note that a lot of couples take somewhere between 3 and 12 months as well. And when there's only a 20% chance of successful fertilization on the day of ovulation, you can see why, you can see why a couple of months are necessary just given the random nature of the biology. One of the things I want to call out on this slide is that current medical guidelines recommend that after trying for 12 months without getting pregnant, that it's time to go see a doctor. However, if you're over the age of 35, they recommend going to see a doctor after 6 months of unsuccessfully trying to conceive. Okay, so we've talked about the data and all the additional facts about fertility that you might want to layer in as you're thinking about your timeline. What age do you want to have your first kid? Does your partner live close by when you can attempt to conceive on those important days within the menstrual cycle? And so we've gone over the basics and some of the data, but as I mentioned, some couples will not be able to successfully conceive after 12 months of trying without medical assistance. And so I think it's really important to talk about the options that are out there, especially because these options tend to be where a lot of costs come. So one of the reasons that we have to talk about medical intervention is that our biology isn't changing as fast as society is changing. And more often, we're having kids later in life in our 30s and 40s, but we still have the biological reality that fertility is declining throughout this window. Another important thing to bring up is the challenges with getting pregnant for same-sex couples. If you're in a same-sex sex couple, you might not have sperm, you might not have an egg or a uterus, and that that means that it's necessary to bring in some medical intervention and work with a doctor so that you can get pregnant. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the many and varied ways to have a family. We've already talked a little bit about unassisted pregnancy, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. Egg freezing, which I'll go into more detail on the next slide, is the most common way to preserve female fertility for those who are delaying pregnancy, whether by choice or by circumstance. We can move into assisted reproductive technology, where there are a number of different options depending on the specific fertility challenges a couple might be facing. Intrauterine insemination, which involves injecting sperm directly into the uterus, is often a first step for lesbian couples. And that's because the main objective is to just introduce sperm to make sure it's there when ovulation happens so that the egg can be fertilized. In vitro fertilization is really common in a wide number of circumstances. And that might include if a female has a blocked fallopian tube, if the male has male factor infertility and for whatever reason the sperm is unable to get to the egg, as well as unexplained infertility. So some proportion of infertility is unexplained, and in vitro fertilization can sometimes address that. I'll also dive into in vitro fertilization in a few slides. Reciprocal IVF is sort of a subset of in vitro fertilization, but it's really common among same-sex lesbian couples. In reciprocal IVF, one partner will donate her eggs, the other partner will carry the pregnancy. And in this way, both partners can be involved in the pregnancy process. Next, we have donor sperm and donor egg. And so for same-sex couples or certain instances of male or female infertility, you might need to acquire sperm or egg outside of your partnership. This can come from family, this can come from friends, this can come from anonymous donors as well. Last of the assisted reproductive technologies is surrogacy. And so surrogacy is most common among gay couples, but sometimes is necessary in male-female partnerships if the female has a uterine issue. And no matter what the need is for surrogacy, there's actually a third person who will carry the pregnancy for the couple. Lastly, I want to bring up adoption. There are many types of adoption, public and private adoptions through foster care or other agencies, and even international adoption. So all of these really represent all the options we have available to us to have a family. And so as I mentioned, I want to go on to the next slide to talk more deeply about egg freezing. Egg freezing is the most common way we have to preserve female fertility, and it is the most successful. I quickly want to walk through the steps, but then also talk about the pros and cons of the process. So the goal of egg freezing is to extract and freeze as many eggs as possible so that they can be used for future use. You might remember when I was talking about the fact that fertility declines with age, and one of the important things that changes is the egg quality. Now, the great thing about freezing eggs is that once they are frozen, the eggs stop aging. So if you freeze them at age 30, they're going to have the genetic health of a 30-year-old, even if you use them at 35 or 38 or 40 or 43. And what really matters in these cases, it matters the health of the egg, and it matters much less the age of the uterus, which is actually very interesting. In fact, I will tell you one interesting story. It made a lot of headlines, I think, in the last few months, where a couple who was really struggling to get pregnant, the female in the partnership was not able to carry the pregnancy, and actually her mother was the one who carried the pregnancy for the couple. And so again, doesn't matter the age of the uterus, it's really all about the age of the eggs. So let's go back to the process. What happens is that we use hormones injected into the body for a span of about 10 to 14 days. These hormones coax the ovary to produce and mature many eggs instead of just one, right to the point before ovulation. At that point, a doctor will go in and actually retrieve those eggs using a very thin needle under anesthesia. Afterwards, they're frozen in about minus 200 degrees Celsius. Now, the benefit of egg freezing is that it allows you the opportunity to sort of put a pause on the fertility aging process and to freeze eggs at a younger age when they're more likely to be successful, and then turn around and use them when you were older. For anyone who is thinking about intentionally delaying pregnancy for professional reasons or for people who are not in a partnership, it can relieve some of the pressure of this age-related fertility decline. However, I think it is really important to note that egg freezing is not a guarantee of future pregnancy. It depends on the number of eggs that are able to be retrieved and the quality of those eggs. Often, doctors aim to freeze of about 20 eggs to give a reasonable chance at future pregnancy. And in some cases, getting to that number requires multiple cycles. A single cycle of egg freezing can cost between $10,000 and $15,000. And so if you might be facing multiple cycles, it's really, really important to understand what you're paying for and what that gets you at the end when you're ready to start trying to have a family. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about in vitro fertilization. It actually starts out the same way as egg freezing, where we use hormones to coax the ovary to make as many eggs as possible. They are retrieved, but then these are where the two processes differ. All of the eggs that are retrieved are then fertilized with sperm, either from the partner or from a donor, and a single egg is then transferred to the uterus to establish a pregnancy. And because of that, IVF is typically used in couples who are trying to get pregnant right away. Any extra embryos that are left over after the fertilization step but aren't transferred are then frozen and can be used in further attempts. It is worth noting for anyone who freezes their eggs, as I described on the previous slide, in order to use them, you have to thaw the egg, fertilize, and transfer. So you do come back and use this sort of second half of in vitro fertilization after freezing eggs. IVF is even more expensive than egg freezing, making it even more important to really get a handle on how this is going to impact your finances and how to consider saving for it. So I'll turn it over to Brian to go through some of those details.
Thank you. So yeah, as you mentioned, the financial considerations of the different options that we talked about related to egg freezing, IVF, and even surrogacy. I think there's three components of it that we see talking through with members and what they can think through. I think number one is going to be, how do we understand high level what the costs would be that we'd be preparing for? What are some different options that we could use to save? And then ultimately, if we can't save enough money for that, what are options related to borrowing? So at a high level, looking at the costs, what we see on average is for egg freezing in the ballpark of $10,000 to $15,000, IVF in the ballpark of $15,000 to $30,000, and then surrogacy, $100,000 and up. So those can be pretty substantial costs. One of the things that we always encourage members to do when we're working through is, again, understanding what employee benefits they have available to them. Although it may be rare, there are some employee benefit providers that do offer assistance in these different areas. So it's always a critical aspect to explore before you move on to the next two options. So the first option would be understanding different ways to save. We've looked at this a handful of different ways, and it really depends on the individual's personal circumstances and how far ahead they are planning ahead for this. Do they just consider this a larger part of their emergency fund, or do they actually plan for this, let's say 1-2 years down the road, as just a what-if type of scenario, and then if they don't need it, then they reallocate it for other purposes? Typically what we see is anytime you're saving ahead for this, we want to encourage, this tends to be a shorter term time horizon. And anytime we're going to use money in the shorter term, we want to make sure that it's going to be put into an account that's going to be accessible, it's going to be liquid, and you're going to have access to it without market fluctuations when you need it. So typically what we see is people setting aside money for this in, let's say, a high yield savings account or some sort of cash management account that may not honestly provide the highest returns, but it's not going to be subject to any sort of market volatility, if you do need it. On the other side of things, we have seen, often many times, individuals who are working through this that really rely on borrowing funds that they ultimately look to pay back. I think anytime we're working through those different options, it's important to understand some of the alternatives for borrowing funds. So going through kind of a pecking order and saying, okay, what access to capital may I have? So one option would be if you have equity in your home. That typically would be a relatively low cost to access that equity through, let's say, a cash out refinance or maybe a HELOC. Another option would be through, maybe if you don't have enough equity built up in your home, then you would then look to, okay, let's say retirement plans through a combination of, let's say, a 401k loan or anything along those lines. And then finally after that, that's where we'd move down to more, I guess, unsecured borrowing, whether it be for leveraging a personal loan or leveraging credit cards. I think it's important to start thinking through this ahead of time as you're planning out different sources of borrowing, because the first two options that I mentioned related to tapping into equity of your home or even tapping into borrowing money from a retirement plan, that typically comes with lower costs over the long term and lesser impact towards your long-term finances, and let's say some sort of unsecured type of borrowing as you're kind of going through this overall journey. So now we'll transition. I noticed there's been some questions that have been thrown into the Q&A. So as we transition to this, just want to remind everyone that tomorrow, if you're anything like me, you like watching recordings of webinars just because you missed something and you're scribbling down notes or whatever it may be, unless I'm the only nerd that's got a notepad here taking notes. But you'll get a recording tomorrow, so that way you'll have access to it. You could also schedule a complimentary conversation with one of our financial planners by going to sofi.com/sofinancial, and you can chat with Modern Fertility. But please feel free to talk into or enter in any questions that you have. We have a bunch entered so far. So we will go through and answer these, and it looks like we have a bunch of questions related to the biological side of things, not related to the financial side of things. Okay, so first one, what can I do to increase my reproductive health?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we talked a little bit about some of those things, which include not smoking, healthy diet, as well as getting exercise. One of the things I didn't mention, but I think is worth talking about, is just reducing exposure to toxins and other things that might affect your reproductive organs. And one of those things that you can do to help in that regard is just decrease your exposure to plastics. Plastics also often contain what are called endocrine disrupting chemicals. So not storing your food in plastics, not microwaving food in plastics. That's one really simple step you can do to sort of reduce your exposure to some of those things.
Perfect. So another question coming your way. What is the optimal year timelines for egg freezing, and how should I think about freezing eggs in the context of other financial priorities? Is there an age that is too old to freeze my eggs?
Okay, I love this question. It is a really great question. It reminds me of one of my favorite papers in the field where someone actually looked and they modeled out what is the cost to success ratio in terms of the best age to freeze. And so what I'll tell you is a finding from that paper. Please keep in mind that individual circumstances certainly differ, but what they found in that paper is that the highest chance of success was achieved if eggs were frozen before the age of 34. But the most cost-effective age was age 37. Now, is there an age that's too old? The reality is it really depends on what your personal reproductive timeline is. If you are 40 years old and you want to have 3 kids, then it might make a ton of sense for you to freeze eggs at age 40. So it really depends. It's super important to have a conversation with your doctor or even meet with a reproductive endocrinologist. The one thing I will say, a little plug for Modern Fertility, because we didn't talk a tremendous amount about what Modern Fertility does. You can understand your hormones better, and and when I say hormones, let me take a step back, your reproductive hormones that give you a sense of how many eggs are left in your ovaries. And knowing that information can let you know how successful egg freezing might be for you. And so knowing a little bit more about that, talking to a reproductive endocrinologist or doing the Modern Fertility hormone test can also give you another piece of information to understand whether this is going to be the right choice for you, given your body, your timeline, and importantly, your financial priorities. Brian, I don't know if you want to add anything specifically about how to think about freezing eggs in the context of other financial priorities, but I think it is really individual and balanced by your sort of personal timeline and goals.
Yeah, I honestly, I think it's entirely up to the individual, because everyone has different financial priorities. And sure, if you take, human behavior and just life in general out of the mix, there's all sorts of things that, could be done to be optimal financially. But at the end of the day, money is there to accomplish the things that you want to accomplish in life. So, typically we don't encourage people to completely defer related to their finances. So, and on the topic of Modern Fertility, I want to make sure that I let everyone know that for a limited time, SoFi members will be getting 20% off Modern Fertility kit. So more info is going to be added to the email that goes out tomorrow, but I wanted to make sure I mentioned that before we moved on. And we'll move on to the next question. So this one, we'll do a two-part answer, one on your side of things and one on my side of things. So I'm several years out from starting a family, but I know I want to have kids. What are things I should be doing now? So can you handle your side of things, and then we'll toss back over to the financial side?
Totally. Yeah. So some of those things are adopting just healthy lifestyle behaviors that we talked about before. But one of the things I'll specifically call out that's relatively easy to do is tracking your menstrual cycle. So if you're not on birth control, or in some cases, depending on the exact birth control you're on, understanding your cycle better will give you a better sense of when you might be ovulating. Are you ovulating regularly? If your cycle is really irregular, it might point to some reproductive condition that a doctor would be able to treat. So I think understanding your cycle better is one of those really low effort things you can do to just better prepare yourself. It can trigger conversations with your doctor and an overall discussion about your timeline and plan. So that might be the number one thing I'd recommend.
Yeah, I think from a financial standpoint, there's, I think, two things. Number one, I think it's absolutely critical to have a conversation with your significant other as you're planning ahead. Because ultimately, each of you will want to do different things and prioritize different things as you get closer to having a family. My wife and I, we went through this, and my priority was, having a safety net and having enough financial flexibility to be able to handle anything that came my way. And my wife, on the other hand, she was like, okay, I want to travel a little bit and I want to, live it up before we have kids. And we had to kind of, those were a little bit conflicting. So we had to get on the same page and actually go through that to make sure we were ready to go. I think the other, pointer I think I would throw out there related to preparing would be the importance of an emergency fund. A lot of people talk about having a cash cushion or a rainy day fund or whatever it may be. And I think, I've heard it from multiple members who, had children or even myself. I think it becomes much more important as you transition throughout different life stages to make sure you have an appropriate emergency fund in place, because things will come up, whether it be along the journey related to fertility, whether it be, related to childcare when you have a kid, or just, beyond in life happening. So I think it becomes absolutely critical. All right, next question. How would you start planning for a woman with PCOS that struggles to conceive?
Great question. So before I dive into the answer, I'll just explain what PCOS is for people who may not be familiar with this term. So PCOS refers to polycystic ovary syndrome, and it's a reproductive condition that is most notably associated with irregular or absent ovulation. And so what I mean by that is an egg is either never released to become available for fertilization, or if it is released, it happens so randomly that if you're trying to find that day, it can be really difficult to find find the day and time intercourse to it. So if someone knew they had PCOS, the first place to start is with your doctor and understanding your personal ovulation. Are you ovulating? Are you not? So there are medication and lifestyle interventions that can be used to encourage natural ovulation, or medications that can trigger ovulation. So that is probably my best bet. And then again, it goes back to the previous recommendation that if you're tracking your cycle and understand, are you regular or irregular, that can be a really, really helpful clue. And again, have those conversations with your doctor.
Perfect. So next question is related to the financial side of things. And there was a handful of questions related to the cost of pregnancy, the cost of having a kid, medical bills, things like that. So I'll kind of lump them all in the same question, because I think there's 3 or 4. How much money should I expect to pay in medical bills for pregnancy and delivery? You know, we're joking before the call. It seems like it depends is a very common answer in both of our fields. So it really does depend. On average, the hospital cost and medical cost associated with having a child nationally is about $3,500. Now, that is going to vary substantially, but depending on the method of childbirth, depending on the hospital stay, any complications, and most importantly, your health insurance coverage. I mentioned it a couple times throughout, today when it comes to the financial aspect of it. I think employee benefits and health insurance are one of the things that get overlooked the most when it comes to people's personal finances. So granted, I'm more of a financial nerd than most people, but as soon as my wife and I decided that, we wanted to have a family in the not too distant future, we went through and we reviewed our employee benefits. We reviewed what her benefits were, what my benefits were, what each of them would have, and then also looking at, the different enrollment periods. So I would go through that and then talk to your healthcare provider or your health insurance provider, and they can go through and actually pull up estimates for you depending on different scenarios. And you can find out about all the extras that may come with it that could be super critical. All right, next question. Is it possible to go through the IVF process without additional hormones?
Wow, this is a really great question. And yes, it is possible. So it's often called natural IVF. Unfortunately, I feel a little bit like a broken record. It's really important to talk to your doctor or to a reproductive specialist about this. One of the things to consider when it comes to natural IVF is that what the hormones do when they're injected is that they encourage many eggs to grow. When you're doing natural IVF, you only get the single egg, typically, that is matured. And so it's just, I was going to use the word high throughput, but I feel like it's unfair to put the human body to describe it as high throughput. But you may just have to go through many, many more rounds of natural IVF as opposed to one that is assisted with hormones. So it's definitely a conversation with a fertility specialist to understand the pros and cons and your specific situation.
Perfect. All right, next question coming your way as well. What percentage of people who freeze their eggs end up using them? Is freezing your eggs at 34 still worth it?
Yeah, this is a great question. And to be completely honest, it's very difficult to answer. And that is because egg freezing was removed from the experimental medical treatment in 2012, which means people have only been able to access this, without an extenuating medical circumstance for 8 years. And so we just don't have a ton of data on this. And so while the number of people who are freezing their eggs increases every year, the number of people who are actually coming back and using those eggs is very, very small. And so we still don't have really good estimates on the chance of success given what age you freeze. One thing I will say is that often if you have frozen your eggs and you decide to get, to try to get pregnant 3, 5, 10 years later, fertility doctors will still recommend trying naturally for a few months because of the significant cost savings associated with trying naturally as opposed to using those frozen eggs. But it is a great question, and it is still, frankly, a pretty big blind spot in the field, given how new it is.
Great. So next question, we'll take a financial one. In your experience, what's the most unexpected cost associated with family planning? In all honesty, I think the most unexpected cost would be related to changes in lifestyle and preferences, which is really, I think, why an emergency fund or having, honest conversations and really direct conversations with your significant other and with yourself of what's important to you is important early on. I think I interact with a lot of couples that develop a plan for their career, their childcare, their feeding, how they're gonna, conceive, all these different things. And then it changes, and they may not be prepared for the changes that may happen. I'm a perfect example of that. My wife and I had our daycare for our son picked out when she was like 2 months pregnant. And then we got home from the hospital and we both started crying and realized that we couldn't send him to daycare. And luckily we had an emergency fund to fall back on until we could fit a nanny in our budget. So things like that will change. And I think just be prepared for those types of changes so they're not unexpected. All right, next question. Okay, we're going to be shifting related to okay, so here's a sincere question. Does a turkey baster actually work as a method of, I'm going to mispronounce this, intrauterine insemination? Saw this on a TV show and a movie. First of all, did I pronounce that word correctly? And then second of all, the answer.
You nailed it, intrauterine insemination. So I'm going to get into, well, first I'll answer the question. Yes, it actually works. I think the detail here is that a turkey baster, you're basically putting sperm into the vagina up near the cervix, not into the uterus. And so if you go into a clinic will actually use a catheter and it will transfer the sperm directly into the uterus. At home, often this is more an intracervical insemination, which again is getting into the nitty gritty and is a little overly specific. One thing I will say though, what is common sometimes for at-home methods is actually using a menstrual cup rather than a turkey baster or some sort of type of syringe. And so a menstrual cup can be inserted close to the cervix, and it just gives the sperm easy access to the cervix to move into the uterus and fallopian tube. So yes, it does work. It is something that people are doing. However, there are some risks associated with it. And so if this is something you're interested in doing, I would really recommend talking to a doctor about it. And they can they can de-risk it and make sure that you're doing it safely at home.
Great. So next question is also coming your way. What new research has been conducted with getting pregnant or being pregnant during a global pandemic like COVID? Basically, what are the risks and is it safe?
This is such a great question, and you can imagine that there's a tremendous amount of research being done in this area. And unfortunately, there are more open questions than there are answers. The American Society for Reproductive Medicine has their personal recommendation based on evidence. They have a specific task force that is looking into this. And so far, they say the evidence does not suggest that people should stop getting pregnant. One thing I will mention is we're only 6 months into this global pandemic, and pregnancy is 9 months long. So we still we have no data on someone who has gotten pregnant and been pregnant for the entire length of COVID. So as I mentioned, there's still some answers we don't have, but generally it is thought to be safe. The American Society of Reproductive Medicine is not encouraging women to put pregnancy plans on pause, but if it is something you're concerned about, it is worth talking about. There is some evidence on the impact of infections among pregnant women. So really making sure you have a plan to socially distance and isolate and not try to expose yourself. But generally, the overall answer is it is recommended to continue pregnancy by medical bodies.
Great. So the next question is, you talked a little bit about freezing eggs, does the same hold true for freezing sperm? Basically, as a 40-year-old male, should I be looking into freezing my little guys?
This is a great question. And now I apologize for not even addressing this. But yes, the same thing holds true for sperm. So sperm do acquire genetic changes over the lifetime. And so that is thought to be the main reason that later in life, it can take couples with older male partners longer to get pregnant naturally. There are services out there that will send you a kit to your home and allow you to freeze sperm. As I mentioned, though, there doesn't seem to be an effect really until the mid to late 40s and then into the 50s. So if you are thinking that 5, 10, 15 years down the road, you want to try to start a family, it might not be a bad idea to look into.
Great. So next one, I think we got time for one or two more questions. This one just came in. Are there any long-term side effects, i.e. health, menopausal, et cetera, of non-biological contraception?
I'm almost going to ask a clarifying question of non-biological contraception. Oh no, I'm just like completely misreading it, of non-biological conception. So if you use assisted reproductive technologies, okay, I was just totally out of left field. Okay, are there any long-term side effects? This is a great question, and I will admit that I am not an expert in this area. There is some, people have studied the effect of these hormones. So specifically for IVF, studied the effect of the hormones on things like breast cancer and ovarian cancer, because you are injecting a lot of hormones, and the concern is, could this cause some sort of problem with breast cancer or ovarian cancer? While there are differences in the research among people who have undergone IVF, I think the best data to look at is people who donate their eggs for other people to use. So these are typically women who are younger, they don't have infertility issues, and they're often doing many, many rounds of the hormone injections and the retrieval. And generally, by and large, what the data has shown is that among this group, there's no long-term effects. There might be slightly increased risks for breast cancer and ovarian cancer. But again, I'm not the perfect expert on this. And so I really recommend, if that's a concern of yours or something that might be true in your family, really have a conversation of those risks with a fertility specialist.
Perfect. So that about wraps us up for today. I want to thank you for joining us today, and thank everyone for attending the session. Just a quick reminder, there'll be a follow-up email going out tomorrow. If you want to talk to a financial planner about the financial side of things, you can go to sofi.com/sofinancial. If you want to chat with Modern Fertility, support@modernfertility.com. The recording and additional information will be in an email. And thank you again for joining us, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks, everyone.